Hello ladles and germs. This video is about international trade, and we're going to introduce the idea of external economies of scale. So when we're talking about external economies of scale, what we mean by that is that as a local industry grows, focusing on a particular industry, where often the firms are geographically clustered. This is not necessary, but it's often the case. So think of something like Silicon Valley, for example. Anyway, when a local industry grows, the average costs of production fall for all of the firms in that industry. So this is not to be confused with internal economies of scale. Internal economies of scale focuses on a particular firm, not on an industry as a whole. So what we're going to do from here on in is to illustrate the impact of external economies of scale in the context of international trade using the standard demand-supply model. Again, we're assuming in a standard demand-supply model that we're dealing with a perfectly competitive market or industry. And of course, we know that that is not realistic. The point is, in using it, is to illustrate an underlying idea. It's not to describe reality in itself. So we're then going to look at the implications for domestic industries when there's free trade in the presence of external economies of scale. And then we'll ask the question, is it an iron law that the implications that we look at will necessarily follow? Spoiler. Nope. Let's start off by saying we've got Australia and Korea with their own respective car industries. And let's say, as you can now see here, they both have external economies of scale. Their long-run supply curves are downward sloping. Each industry, domestic industry, has its own equilibrium price. However, if we were then to open each country up to trade, and let's say there's only two of them, there's only Australia and Korea in this simple example. When we open them up to trade, what we'll find is that unstable equilibria emerge in each country, something that we can call cumulative causation. So if we open them up to trade, we can immediately see that the price that Korea produces cars at is lower than the price that Australia produces cars at. What do you think's going to happen if Australians and Koreans can choose which car they buy, irrespective of the country it's produced in? Then we would expect Australians to decrease their demand for Australian cars and increase their demand for Korean cars. So some of the demand in Australia is lost to the Korean market. So we can see here we've moved from Korea's demand to Korea plus Australia. We've added some Australian demand to its industry. Now you can see the problem that's going to arise for Australia here. Where's the new equilibrium, the new long-run equilibrium for Australia and Korea? Well, for Australia, it's now higher than it previously was. Things have gotten worse. Meanwhile, for Korea, the new equilibrium is lower than it previously was. From Australia's perspective, the divergence between the domestic price and the Australian price and the Korean price has actually gotten larger, which then encourages Australians to further abandon Australian-produced cars and to start increasing the demand further for Korean cars. Their demand shows up in the Korean market, so to speak. All right, so this is going to make it even worse. Where's the equilibrium now for Australian cars? It's here, at this point. And how many cars are being sold? None. No Australian cars are sold at this price. Meanwhile, the equilibrium in Korea is now an even lower price than it was before. You can see our equilibrium is not stable. For Australia, it goes up and up And for Korea, it's going down and down. It doesn't stick to one place until this point now, because now the Australian industry disappears because there's no demand for its product anymore. Demand is zero at the price that it now charges. And all of the demand has gone to Korea. Korea now produces all the cars for both countries. Not good news, even when there's external economies of scale for Australia. If another country has greater external economies of scale, then you can get this cumulative causation process occurring, where the industry in one country is destroyed. Okay, this seems like bad news. Is this an iron law? Is this inevitable? Is this inescapable? Well, it can certainly seem that way. The logic of it seems good. We can certainly see examples where it seems inescapable, at least for now anyway. And this is where you get cases of what we might call historical path dependency. So for various reasons, some countries have historically specialized in certain industries. So they've already exploited and are continuing to exploit the greater external economies of scale than other countries do. In that situation, kind of like the one we just saw, it's almost impossible to compete with them for now. Here's a few examples. So India has had a comparative advantage in textile and clothing production since the 16th century. One of the targets for colonisation by the British, and just about everyone else for that matter, actually. Brazil has historically had a comparative advantage in coffee production since the 19th century, due partly to its climate and geography, but also because it could take advantage of the external economies of scale which come with a growing industry over time. And Japan in the 20th century developed expertise in precision engineering that gave it a comparative advantage in electronics and automobiles. Nonetheless, governments can facilitate greater external economies of scale themselves that would not naturally occur or don't pre-exist. So it means that nations can strategically shape their own comparative advantages under the banner of export industry assistance, sometimes shortened to industry policy. For example, a government might provide subsidy incentives for firms to geographically cluster. It might provide public goods tailored to an industry, so infrastructure amenities that would be beneficial to that industry in particular. They might provide subsidy incentives for research and development in a particular industry area. They might provide subsidy incentives for industry-specific education to improve the productivity of a workforce and to increase the supply of labour to that industry. Well, if you get a government which is doing all of these things in a very targeted way and works, maybe we can get a different kind of an outcome. So if you recall, this is where we were at the very beginning, and you're thinking about, Australia is thinking about opening up its economy to trade, and the government says, you know what, before we open up to trade, let's establish policies to facilitate external economies of scale so that we will be able to compete and defeat the Korean car market or car industry. So they formulate their plans, and projections indicate that if they did this successfully, you would have a long-run supply curve that would be much lower than it was before. Well, if we move to this lower point here, then we'd be able to sell at a price below the price being offered by the Korean car industry. So would cumulative causation occur in Australia's favour in that case? Well, It's conceivable, but there's a problem. And the problem is that you just don't instantly move to a new equilibrium point. It takes time. It still might be the case that the local price initially could still be higher than the competitor's existing price. Then the cumulative causation process would start with trade, and the Australian industry would be destroyed anyway, in which case all of the support and subsidies would have been a complete waste of money and resources. If we initially are starting production at this level, but now at a lower cost and therefore charging a lower price, you can see the problem here. That price is still above the Korean price, in which case we'd start our cumulative causation process of losing customers to Korea until our industry was destroyed. So that's bad news. Is there a possible solution to this problem? Well, yes, there is. One possible solution is to protect your local industries from imports with tariffs, quotas, or whatever. You could have a quota set at 0, so no one was allowed to import any cars. The industry would have time, starts out here, and then has time to expand down to its equilibrium. And that price is below the Korean price. It's only then that you would open up your economy to trade, knowing that now the cumulative causation process will operate in your favour and allow the Australian car industry to survive and to destroy the Korean car industry. This solution is a variation on what's called the infant industry argument for trade protection. So we set up this trade protection, allow the industry to expand, enjoy the external economies of scale that come with that behind the protective barrier, until you're down to a price which will be able to compete successfully with your competitors, and then you advocate free trade.